Namaste, everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. My guest today is Neel Kolhatkar. Neel, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited.
All right, Neel. So, while a lot of Indians might know you, but I still want to start like this. I want to tell people your journey, because I know you have a lot of fans in India. I mean, I'm one of them actually, and I've been watching your material via YouTube now for a few years. But so let's start like this. Why don't you tell everybody about your journey in Australia and how you got into stand up? So go for it.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me on the podcast, and it's really good to know that I have a fair amount of fans in India. I've been a stand-up comedian for 8 years now. I did my first gig 11 years ago, and I've been pursuing it full-time for 8 years. I started off online. I made some YouTube videos back when the platform was starting. So this would have been 2010, maybe, so a decade ago. And they gained a bit of traction in my school and in my local area in Sydney. I'm from Sydney, Australia. I grew up in Australia, and I really enjoyed what I was doing. I wanted to do acting previously, but I started dabbling in, comedic acting, character acting. I really like actors like Sacha Baron Cohen and Chris Lilly, who's here from Australia. And I just felt like stand-up comedy was a natural step towards that passion. But then I actually fell in love with the craft of stand-up. And because I gained a decent following here in Australia, I was able to sell shows and post some of my stand-up online. And then that grew into an even larger following. And for the last 6-7 years, I've been doing this full time, continually growing, been able to travel to America and the UK, perform there. I've performed to theatres here in Australia. I suppose that's it. I made that series Crossing the Line last year. I'm known for a few of my short films. I made a short film, Modern Education, a few years ago, and that really hit a nerve with a lot of people all across the world, and it went hugely viral. So I suppose that's a very brief introduction to my career so far. I think I covered everything there. If you have any more questions about my comedy or my content.
So I actually did want to ask you a specific question about Modern Education. So I've seen that video of yours. So let's start with that, and then we can get into Crossing the Line. But that was a very interesting video. So if I was, I watch your content regularly, and you're basically touching into a lot of what is going on in. Honestly, it's not really much of a thing in India. Not that it doesn't affect India in the academics. I do think postmodernism and that cultural ideology does come into Indian academia too, and people don't realize that. But still, it's not a thing that is discussed in India. But here's my question. So when you were making that video about modern education, now I'll ask this question in a very weird way, because now most of the times what I observe is that it's like, so everybody likes to call this the oppression Olympics, right? So everybody who's not white basically is trying to get some sort of a medal in the oppression Olympics. So you're obviously not white. I mean, it's quite obvious. So what was going on in your head? So what was going on in your head when you decided, okay, you know what, I want to make a video about modern education? And it's a critique on basically that culture of oppression Olympics and victim blaming or victim shaming or whatever. I don't get the whole gist sometimes, because it's so confusing, because at the end of it all, I feel I don't understand who the victim is in the entire process. So why did you decide to make that video in particular?
Well, there was a long lead up as to why I made a film like that. I think you touched on a very interesting point that I would like to illustrate a bit further. Being brown in a country like Australia, I actually am in a minority. So I wouldn't say I was indoctrinated, but I just had the very basic belief that white people do have an easier life here in Australia and things do tend to go their way, whereas I may experience some forms of oppression. But when I as I experienced the comedy scene and the art scene in particular in Australia, I started to realize there was more to it than that. It was this sort of pervasive idea of, the best way I would describe it is, well, yes, postmodernism, but also cultural relativism. So what tended to be the idea among a lot of the people who have power in the arts, at least in Australia, is that if there are disparities in the outcomes of particular groups, that must be as a result of some sort of discrimination or oppression, and it doesn't take into account different behaviors or different culture. And I found that quite frustrating because, first of all, everyone who wasn't white is just lumped into, they're not directly lumped into the same box, but they're sort of branded as a victim. And I found that quite demoralizing and just degrading and patronizing, to be quite honest. And I really wanted to say something about this culture and say something in a very nuanced way. So that was a lot of my inspiration for creating Modern Education. It was controversial at the time. I mean, now there's plenty of anti-SJW or pushback against that pervasive ideology, which seems to have it's not just infiltrated media and academia. It's everywhere now. It's even in the corporate world. So I would say that was the main inspiration. And I was very happy with what I did with Modern Education. I think I articulated what I wanted to say very well. And if there was one thing I would change, I know that the Sunshine character, I probably wouldn't have made him Asian, actually, because I know in America, I mean, I was doing this more from the perspective of someone in Australia, but with some of the race quotas in American colleges, Asians are actually being heavily discriminated against. So that would be the one thing I would change. But other than that, I'm very proud of what I did with that film, and I still think to this day it's my best work. And that would be what I would have to say on Modern Education.
So at a personal level, where was the tipping point where so obviously we are all growing up, we look at things around us, we see what's happening around us. So where was that one particular occasion as a tipping point where you said, enough is enough, I need to start satirizing these things because this is sounding way too weird to me right now?
I wouldn't say there was one particular tipping point, but I would say it would be a culmination of small points that I would experience, especially in the arts world in Australia, because the gatekeepers of media and art were giving opportunities to people based on their identity, as opposed to what many and what I think the majority of people would say is the quality of their art. And that was what really frustrated me. So I can't put my finger on one particular instance, but over the course of a few years, there were numerous instances of that happening, of people clearly getting ahead just because of their identity and the perceived victimhood in their identity. Now, ironically enough, that in some cases actually was an advantage for me, being clearly not white, as we discussed before. And I welcome that, because I did have the idea that, I deserve this because I'm not white, because white people would have otherwise had an advantage. And there's a nuanced conversation to be had about that as well, but I don't think that's a helpful idea to have on a personal level or on a societal level. And I know, as I've slowly detached from that mentality, and I see race less than I ever have. I mean, a lot of my earlier comedy, even then, that was heavily based around race, and I'll still do race jokes, and I think it's important to be able to laugh at cultural differences. But there you go. That's the big difference there. I can see the distinction between race and culture. And culture, this cultural relativism, this idea that all cultures are equal, they're just different. Well, all culture should be treated equally, but we have to be able to analyze the different outcomes of various cultural groups. and not just assume some sort of oppression is taking place if there are disparities, even if there are vast disparities. Again, it doesn't mean that oppression couldn't be a possibility or one of the many factors that could be contributing to that disparity, but the assumption that that is the only factor at play here, well, I think that, well, as I'm sure many people would agree, that that's just simply wrong. Now, I did this from a very Australian-centric point of view, but it resonated all across the world. And I don't know the particular societal, the issues that are at play in every different country. So I don't know if I'm hitting the exact same nerve for people in every different country, but I think it is a testament to how pervasive this ideology is, and it's everywhere. So again, circling back to your question, look, there wasn't one particular instance. I can't really put my finger on one unique event that was the major catalyst for me writing Modern Education, but it was a cumulative build-up of many instances.
Yeah, I kind of understand where you're coming from, because in my own personal understanding, what I see happening in the West is, the old culture in the West used to be and I have problems with that culture too. It's not that there were no problems in that culture. It was more a culture of honor, right? It was an honor-based culture, which still exists in some parts of America. I still believe the southern states of America still have some lingering remnants of the culture of honor. But now I think the entire Western zeitgeist has moved into a culture of victimhood. So, I guess both things have their good points and bad points, where maybe the culture of victimhood might show us the various problems different communities face, and maybe make us more sensitive to those issues. And but then again, if it's done in the extreme, I don't know. To me, at times, because I do watch and follow global politics, not so much Australian politics, but I guess. Maybe because I'm married to someone who's born and raised in North America, so I tend to follow North American politics far more than Aussie politics. But for me, the change, what has happened is, I think, I know it sounds very weird. I actually wanted a review. I think religion is making a comeback. It's just a godless religion. I think the West dumped religion in a big way, and that left a huge internal vacuum. And I think people are just replacing that particular memeplex, where it was a set of ideas, albeit divinely ordained, and they're just replacing it with this new mishmash of. It's so similar if you think about it, right? The old religion had blasphemy, right? I get it. Hindus may not understand blasphemy, but I'm talking about from an Abrahamic point of view, because Hinduism does not have blasphemy, but if all Abrahamic religions have the concept of blasphemy. Now, this new cult that has come up is actually very similar to them, in that sense that they have blasphemy. You can't say this, you can't say that, and if you do, you have blasphemed. So have you seen that? So do you think it is also behaving like a religious cult now?
I think there are definite similarities to what religion would have been once upon a time, and it is a dogmatic idea. I don't know. I can't attest to the exact culture going on in America, but from what we see on social media, I would tend to agree with you. This seems. I'm sorry, it's my cat. This does seem to have very cult-like elements to it, and I can't imagine it would be good in the long term. And as you also said, I think it's important to still not entirely disregard everything that has been spouted from that side of the culture. In fact, there are many things I would agree with as well. But there are certain distinctions. So, for example, equality versus equity. Well, a lot of people say, I just fight for equality. Well, what is your conception of equality? Is it an equality of outcome, or is it equality of opportunity? So I would fight for equality of opportunity, whereas many people on that side would fight for equality of outcome. Now, I would even be open to that if they at least would say well, look, for the next 20 years, we need to have this quota system so that people can see that there are opportunities for people who have their identity. And then after that, we will then get rid of the quota system. But no, there's no caveat like that. It's just there needs to be this perfect synchronicity to the demographics of the population in any this sort of institution, and that there's a lack of analysis as to why some of these disparities occur, and yeah, they seem to have adopted a very dogmatic and very puritanical nature. A lot of people say this is akin to the witch hunts of
It is.
Now, yeah, people aren't being burnt, but it really does seem to be like that. It's a tribe that says, hey, you're not part of the tribe anymore, and then rather than being physically attacked, they're digitally attacked, and that's it. There's no forgiveness. There's no possibility to learn or to grow. And I'm not saying I'm perfect either. There's a lot of jokes and things I've said, particularly when I was a teenager or in my early 20s, where I'd look back on and say that was inappropriate. I shouldn't have said something like that. But I don't think it's fair to judge someone now on who they were 5, 10, 15 years ago. It doesn't mean you don't talk about it and you can still criticize that particular view. But I think the pendulum has just swung far too much in that direction, and we need to claw it back without going too far the other way as well.
All right, so let's talk about your series, Crossing the Line. And I have to state it. I think as an avid consumer of humor and basically the genre that is related to humor, I just thought that was one of the best things I've seen in my life. I remember clearly seeing it at that time, and I had tweeted about it that, this is the best thing I've seen. I was blown away, first of all. So tell me, how did you? I mean, I want to pick your brains here. Tell me how you thought. It's like, I always want to know how people come up with things. Like, how did you think? Okay, let's test the boundaries. So, how did you come up with this thing? What was going on in your head at that time?
Well, as a comedian myself, I couldn't help but notice that there just seemed to be this idea among the comedy community that you can't say what you want to say anymore. Comedy is being policed. Humor just isn't, mainstream comedy isn't funny anymore. So I thought, well, let's test that. Let's test that hypothesis. Let's see how far we can actually push it. And the other main thing I wanted to explore there was that I don't think there will be any sort of universal line as to which jokes are inappropriate, because each person is going to have a very different individual line. Because I think what we're offended by is just emblematic of what we value, and everyone is going to have different values. So that was the other main thing I wanted to show with the web series, is that there's a diversity of views among what is appropriate when it comes to comedy. And I think that definitely did come across, because there were some people who, but after one joke, were not appreciative of what was being said, and then there were some people who didn't have an issue with any of the jokes. And then I also wanted to explore it in a much more nuanced way, because I think what tends to happen now when a comedian comes out with a special that could be seen as provocative or controversial, people either say that was offensive, or no, you're just being sensitive, that wasn't offensive. Well, what about, was it actually funny? Because there were a lot of people in that show that didn't laugh at a joke. It doesn't mean they were offended by it. It just means the joke wasn't that good. Now, that's where comedians have their own bias. I clearly have a bias towards my jokes and my humor. So when people have criticized that, I've immediately become defensive and said, oh, you're just being sensitive. But we also have to look inwards and say, well, were my jokes actually not that good? And I think that came through in Crossing the Line as well. And that was a really important point I wanted to make, that there's a difference between being offended by a joke and not appreciating a joke, or not particularly thinking it's a good joke. And again, there wasn't one instance or one event that made me come up with that concept, but it was just a gradual process over the years as the supposed political correctness around comedy was increasing. I thought it was time to make something like that, and to not just argue online about whether or not comedians are allowed to say what they want anymore. But let's actually test these boundaries and see how far they can go.
So, so when you were testing the boundaries, I have to say I forgot the name of the guy who he was the best guy. There's a guy in the beard who used to laugh at everything. And every time he would laugh, he's like, "I'm in so much trouble," because he was like, "I find everything funny. Is there something wrong with me?" So somebody needs to tell that guy he's the best audience ever, because a comic would love to have a guy like him there because he's laughing all the time. So my question was then, what did you learn in the entire process yourself? Did it change you at an internal level as a comic, where you were like, maybe I should not crack these jokes, or maybe I should work a little more on my, the punchline itself, maybe I can word it better. Did it change you, or did you see any value in the input that the participants who were listening to the jokes that were giving? I'm not talking about the ones like the guy who found everything funny. I'm talking about the people who maybe they took offense. So when they told you that we took offense to this, and when they explained to you that they come from this point of view, did you take that into consideration as a creator too?
On an emotional level, because I was actually observing their faces and they were clearly hurt by some of the jokes. We're all human. We have empathy. I felt some of that hurt, but I don't think just because someone is upset or offended at a joke, it necessarily means that the comedian should then police themselves. You have to ask yourself, okay, what was my intention with that joke? Did I articulate it as best as I could have? I think if there was one thing I did gauge from the variety of reactions I got from those jokes, it would be that comedians should be very meticulous with their material, and ironically enough, not take their profession so lightly, because nowadays comedians do have a lot of cultural power. And if you are going to explore a controversial or offensive topic, be very precise with how you word the joke and exactly what you want to say. But then at the same time, because there was such a variety of views as to which jokes were appropriate and which jokes weren't, and there were differing opinions as to why certain jokes were appropriate or why certain jokes were not appropriate, you can't really take one lesson from seeing all those reactions, because, well, there were about 8 people each episode with a variety of reasons as to why they thought a joke was appropriate or wasn't appropriate. So again, I just circle back to the idea that, well, everyone is an individual, and if a vast majority of your audience are saying are critical of your work, then maybe that's something to look into. But if it's a minority, or if it's if it's not an overwhelming majority, basically, then I don't think comedians should necessarily worry too much about what one person said on Twitter, or why one person thinks certain jokes aren't appropriate as opposed to another person. I think we should listen, but I don't think it's our job to cater to everyone's individual sensibilities, because then you can't even say anything then, quite literally, because there's always going to be someone who finds everything funny, even the most vanilla joke out there. So it's important to take that sort of thing with a grain of salt and listen. But no, look, it's sort of altered my ethos around comedy slightly, and I can see now when there's an actual face behind the person being upset at a joke, that definitely has more emotional weight than just seeing a tweet or a comment. And I'm sure that would affect the comedy I write in future, but I wouldn't say it's drastically or dramatically changed my outlook on comedy and writing.
So here's the thing. So just to follow up on this, so from what I've understood is comics basically they build a joke, right? So from what I've seen, how stand-up comics operate is you try the joke in different, small time clubs, and then you keep on building on the act, and then you have the final finished product where the process involves a lot of getting rid of ABC, maybe changing the bit a little bit of here and there. Yeah. So if a comic was to start getting conscious of everything, oh my God, if he's offended, if she's offended, or Z's offended, and by the time, and the whole process is about building the joke, let's say over a period of 6 to 8 months, when it finally makes a cut, sometimes a year and a half, when it becomes the final act. So don't you think it would become a huge problem if we become so conscious about what we're saying? And on top of that, we're supposed to build, it's like building a muscle, right? You need to work out over a period of time to build a joke. So how does one draw that line then?
Yeah, it differs from comedian to comedian. I would say a sort of moderate, listen to people, but then you don't have to take everyone's opinion into account. Again, I come back to if you've tried a joke 3 or 4 times and absolutely no one has laughed, well, then I understand there's this sort of purist comedy view that says, no, it's the comedian's view it's the comedian's purpose to educate the audience. So regardless of whether they're laughing, the best comedians will just power through. I personally don't really agree with that. I think if you've tried a joke multiple times and it's just not working, I would throw it in the bin. Having said that, if, for example, you try it 3 times, it works most of the time, and then you try it 1 time and it doesn't work, it might be a sign that it needs some tweaking and some minor alteration. But I wouldn't then throw the joke away. And then if you sort of adapt that to a video or a phrase that you're saying on social media instead of an audience, then you're saying, okay, if 1 out of 4 people are upset or offended by what you've said, maybe you need to at least, as best as you can, critically analyze what you've written or what you've said, and potentially tweak it. But I wouldn't immediately discount something if a minority of people or a minority of crowds aren't happy with it. So I think moderation is the key when it comes to that. So you want to take into account the opinion or the response of the audience, but you also want to, if you believe in a joke, stick to it and do power through in some instances. And it can be the case that a joke can be 10-15 minutes long, or at least the funny part comes later on, or you set the audience up tonally with a really provocative and lowbrow joke to begin with, but then that eases them into some of the harsher intellectual comedy that comes later in your set. So context is really important when it comes to a 1-hour comedy show as well. So I would say, yeah, look, take a sort of moderate approach to the refining of a joke. That's my ethos.
All right. So now I wanted to get your views on humor in general. And so you obviously, as you said, you're of Indian origin. You grew up in Australia. You're born and raised there. So have you ever performed in front of audiences who are like Indian, who are only Indian? Have you done? Because I don't know if you've done any gigs in India or not. So I was just wondering. So what's your take on humor? crossing cultures. So what's your experience, if any, if you've performed in front of, as they say, the desis? Have you tried that out? How do they react to your humor?
Well, as I'm sure you're aware, there's a very large Indian diaspora in Australia, especially Melbourne and Sydney, and I have performed to predominantly Indian crowds. They're great. They're fantastic. They adore the Indian jokes in particular, because there is that frame of cultural difference in Australia when you're Indian. Here, you're much more aware of those cultural differences because it's so pronounced, seeing everyone else who's different. I haven't actually performed in India. I've been to the Comedy Store in Bombay. I'd love to. I really would want to perform there one day. I'm sure when international flights are back and running, I'd love to perform there. But my experience performing to Desi crowds in Australia has been hugely positive. They're fantastic crowds. They're very enthusiastic. There's a lot more clapping. Australian crowds very rarely will applaud. They'll applaud at the end of a show, but they very, very rarely applaud in such a raucous manner as well, midway through the show or just after a joke. Whereas Indian crowds are they're uproarious with the way they'll applaud, and they're very generous. And I've enjoyed performing to Indian crowds a lot, because what tends to happen, and I think this was quite evident with Crossing the Line, is that sometimes it's white people who are very protective of minorities, and I think that comes from a place of empathy. They want to ensure that minorities aren't being mocked and put down, and so then they're tentative to laugh at any racial joke, any joke about race, any joke about culture. They're not sure whether they're allowed to laugh at it or whether they should be laughing at it. Whereas clearly Indians would at least be much more inclined to make that distinction from what is just degrading mockery to clever humor. And I'd like to think mine is clever humor. So they're much more, they're not on guard and they're not protective. So they'll laugh, and it's almost liberating to see that. It's quite ironic. I find performing to some of the more well-to-do whiter audiences in Australia, the cultural references just don't. Maybe they are relevant to them, but I think they have this sense of, I'm not sure if am I allowed to laugh at this? Is this racist if I laugh at this joke? Whereas the Indians clearly don't have that. I also think there's a big difference between Indians who have grown up in, well, not just Australia, but Western countries versus Indians who have grown up in India, because Indians who have grown up in Western countries, they've been bullied for that. Not always, but in many cases, they are the minority, and they've been teased for that. And that shouldn't be happening. That's not a good thing. But I think that breeds a sense of insecurity about their race, and also that same sort of protective mechanism. Especially if a white comedian starts making Indian jokes, they'll get defensive and they'll pull back immediately and say, no, hang on, they shouldn't be allowed to be saying that. Whereas I found with Indians who've grown up in India, they're not necessarily threatened by a white person making a joke about Indians, because there's nothing, they haven't really experienced being put down for their culture or their race. And I found that distinction really, really interesting. I mean, I even see that with my parents. My mum grew up in Australia, whereas my dad grew up in Bombay. So I even see that dynamic interplaying between them. So I find that really, really interesting. But look, overall, performing to Indian crowds, and you know what, just multicultural crowds in Australia in general, I find very rewarding, and they're fantastic crowds.
Yeah. So have you ever noticed that when you crack a joke on on Indian people or your own people, and there'll be Indians laughing in the crowd, and there'll be a bunch of white folks not laughing, and then they'll be like, okay, I guess I can laugh. He's laughing too. Has that ever happened? Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah. Look, I have seen a lot of that sort of stuff that happens, and again, I think that comes from a place of empathy. But it also comes from, I'm not sure, sometimes I feel like it's almost an infantilization of minorities and people of color. Even that term, people of color, I don't particularly like that term. But yeah, I have definitely found that. I mean, I remember hearing this a few years ago. My then girlfriend was talking about how she was serving some people. She worked a hospitality job, and she was serving some people, and she was describing them, and she was saying, "Oh, these Indians came into the shop," and then her other white friend was like, "Oh no, you can't say that. You can't say that." And I was like, "What? How can she say that? They were Indian. You can say that they were Indian. That's not offensive." So it's this sort of overprotective nature, which again, I think it comes from a good place, but it almost gets to the point where it's degrading. I mean, I feel that way sometimes. So yeah, I have definitely seen that, where I think Jordan on Crossing the Line said it the best, where if a subject of if a joke is targeting a particular cultural or ethnic group, and someone from that group laughs, it gives everyone else permission to laugh. So I've definitely seen evidence of that when I've performed.
Yeah, so it's very interesting because I've seen Russell Peters now twice in Bombay. When he has come to Mumbai, he's performed, and the crowds are packed. And people don't get it. Like, a lot of times, Russell's act, especially when he's in India, it's 70% about Indian people, and Indians are laughing when Russell's basically making fun of us. He's literally making fun of us in our house. He's coming here, and then there are a bunch of people telling Russell, "Oh, you can't do that." And Russell's like, "Look, I go to their place, I sit with them, they're my people, I make fun of them, and you're going to tell me which joke is okay and which joke is not when they're actually laughing at my stuff." So how do you react when somebody who's actually not Indian tells you, "Oh, you can't crack that joke, it's offensive to Indians"?
I ignore them. Basically, look, I'll listen to what they have to say, but it's a strange mentality when you think about that. I mean, someone lecturing someone who's from that particular culture what they can say about that culture, that's just bizarre. I mean, I also, because in Western Sydney, or just Sydney in general, where I've grown up, it's a melting pot. There's a lot of different ethnicities and races, and I grew up around many of them. So I'll make jokes about, I won't just make jokes about Indians and Australians. They're probably the main groups I target. But then I'll make fun of there's a large Lebanese population in Australia, and I'll make fun of them. I'll make fun of the Greek and Italian migrant. They're now second, third, fourth generation. They came post World War II, and I'll make fun of them. And I'll make fun of, I don't think there's any group that's off limits. So I'll make fun of a lot of them, and then that's when I've received some more pushback. I've received criticism about, you're not allowed to make fun of this particular group because you're not from that particular group. Now, I understand that I may not have the knowledge of that group that other people have. I don't ever think it's not permissible for someone to make fun of a group that they're not a part of, but I do think you should be wary of how good the joke is, for example. So, I've seen some comedians make brilliant Indian jokes, and then they're not Indian, but they clearly know a lot about the culture, and they've experienced it a lot more than maybe the average person, and the jokes are really fantastic. Whereas I've also seen some jokes that just aren't that funny, for me at least, and they're not that clever. Having said that, I would never say, oh, that's offensive, you can't say that. I'll just say, all right, it's not for me. That's clearly very sort of shallow observation of that particular group, and most people might just see that and that's what they observe, so they find it funny and it's providing them humor. So look, that's fine, as long as it's then the burden is shared equally and they're also making fun of other races and cultures. But I've never seen a comedian who particularly picks on one race as opposed to another. That would be strange. So look, I'm definitely more inclined to say that jokes are, everyone should be allowed to make fun of any race and any culture, and then anyone should be allowed to criticize them as well. But that shouldn't necessarily deter comedians from making fun of that group or that ethnicity. And you know what? a good indication of how accurate your jokes are of a group is whether or not that group comes to your shows and whether they like you and whether they follow you. Because if they do, chances are the jokes are great. The jokes are fantastic. And there might be a minority of people who still don't necessarily approve. I mean, even when it just, a lot of British comedians will tour Australia, and the ones that have gained the most traction here are the ones that have made fun of Australians, because Aussies love being made fun of if it's done in the right way. If it's a sort of acute observation about the way we go about our business, about our mannerisms, because Aussies have some very peculiar mannerisms, to say the least. And when someone is aware of that and has noticed those things, that's very endearing. Even though they're making fun of us, it's great that they've noticed that, and we're more than happy to laugh at something like that. And I'm sure that the same rule applies to Indians or to any cultural group.
Yeah, the only thing I want to look forward to is, because I've seen your act, and a lot of it is adult humor. I just want to see that occasion where some senior Indian uncle auntie comes up to you and says, "Beta, you should not do this." I just want to see what happens there. That would be the best moment of my life. I don't know if it's ever happened with you.
No, not yet. Oh, look, there were some seniors at some of the shows I've been to, but they laugh. They seem to like it as well. So I guess there is a generational divide and I don't think that just applies to Indians. I think even older white people, of any ethnicity, comedy isn't an art form that they're used to being exposed to, or that that style of comedy isn't really something they've been exposed to. I think as you move down the generations, comedians have much more intellectual respect, whereas I think the older generations comedians were just clowns essentially, and jokers that when it came to the real issues, serious cultural, political, social issues, a comedian would never comment on that. So look, that will be funny. I'm sure it'll happen one day. And look, there are even what Russell Peters said it the best. When you grow up in Canada or Australia, and everyone's like, "You're Indian, you're Indian, you're Indian," so you think, "Okay, yeah, I'm Indian." And then you go to India, and you're like, "Oh no, I'm not. I'm Aussie. I'm very Aussie." And the exact same thing happened to me. So that's why a lot of my earlier jokes were a lot more based around me being Indian and my observation as the other and the sort of different person. But look, I'm Aussie. Like culturally, that's what I am. I'm very immensely proud of my Indian heritage, and definitely still have. My parents still brought me up with some Indian cultural ideas. But ultimately, if you ask me, I realize now I'm an Aussie, I'm Australian, and I'll even look back at some of the jokes I made earlier on in my career about Indians, and I would say, well, I wouldn't necessarily do that today. But that's another thing. You comedians evolve, and this kind of cancel culture. If someone's done something criminal in the past, that should be brought up. But if they've said something that if looked through the lens of today's sensibilities is deemed inappropriate, you got to give them a chance to grow and to at least entertain the fact that they may not be that same person. And quite often, a lot of those tweets and jokes are taken completely out of context, and the tone at which at how they're saying it isn't looked at all. And when you write a stand-up joke, when you actually write it down, it can have a very different effect versus someone delivering a joke, again, in the context of a 1 hour show where maybe they've said some other jokes in relation to that joke in question. They're interacting with the audience. They're saying it in a very tongue-in-cheek manner. There's an extent of sarcasm involved as well. when that's written down, or when a journalist or a social commentator says the joke that a comedian said, and when they say it, it sounds very offensive. Well, yeah, that's because they're not a comedian. That's the whole point of a comedian. They say things that can be controversial and offensive, but they make it funny. So really, there just needs to be a much more thorough examination of some of these jokes that are deemed inappropriate from yesteryear, and whether or not comedians should be socially ostracized. And then even like, I feel like in the same way that the boy who cried wolf, just no one believed him after a while. We're just a society that keeps canceling people. So now that canceling doesn't even have an effect anymore. I mean, you hear another comedian got cancelled, you just roll your eyes and think, okay, well, what did they do this time? So when a comedian actually does something wrong, no one's going to care if they get cancelled, because we're just cancelling people for the most mundane things that they've said. But anyway, that's a tangent. But
yeah, I hear you. I hear you. So, and actually, I can relate to the part where you said you're an Aussie. So it's a very funny incident. So I'll tell you my personal life. So I'm married to someone who's born and raised in Canada. So, so as we like to call you all, confused desis, right? So, so yeah, my wife would be like, "I'm Indian," all the time. She'd be like, "I'm Indian." I was like, "No, you're Canadian." She's like, no, I'm Indian. And now she's with me in Mumbai now for 12 years now. And yeah, she's Canadian. She tells me that now.
Yeah. I relate to that. I definitely relate to that.
Yeah. So it's very interesting, because the moment you said that, I was like, yeah, I get you, man. You're Aussie. You're just, so that's the thing. Like, so when did you come to that realization that, or do you identify yourself as just a comic who happens to be brown? Because I know some comics who have bought into this identity politics thing too much, and they actually have started to identify as, black comics, white comics, brown comics. I mean, it wasn't just that I'm a comic and that's good enough. I just happen to be black, white, brown. Isn't that the ideal scenario?
I think that should be the ideal scenario. I don't like to identify myself as the Indian comedian or even the Indian Australian comedian. And a lot of times in the media, they seem to use that introduction. I mean, I am an Indian comedian, I guess, but I don't think the Indian portion of that title really should define it. Comedy should be the main aspect of that career identity. So any comedian is going to talk about what relates to them and their life experiences. And if you do have that cultural point of difference, if you are a minority and you grow up with a different culture, you are then you're more aware of you become more aware of other cultures because you see the differences. Whereas if you grow up in the majority culture, you don't necessarily observe those differences because you don't have that frame of reference. And that doesn't go for just being Indian. That goes for almost anything. I'm sure if you were gay and most people were straight, or even if you're just freakishly tall and everyone else isn't, that's why whatever is a sort of unique aspect of either your personality or your physique tends to be the point of a lot of your comedy. And that makes perfect sense because it's something you're a lot more acutely aware of because it's so different about you. So I agree with you. I don't like to really see myself as the Indian comedian. There aren't many comedians of Indian descent in us. Ironically enough, there's two Sri Lankan comedians who are quite famous now in Australia.
Nice.
And then there's a third one who's on the way up. So there's more of them. There's not enough Indians. But I'm trying to. There's actually. There are a few. There's these two twins that I found on TikTok. Oh, I heard TikTok just got banned in India. I heard that.
Yeah.
But they were doing really well on TikTok. But wait a minute, they're half Indian, half Sri Lankan. So okay, well, something about the Sri Lankan. We need a quota for more Indians in
Yeah. So I had one grouse with you, which I had shared on the email too. That So you did the entire Crossing the Line series. So
Yeah.
you tried the Jews, you tried
Yeah.
the Muslims, you tried white people, you tried
Oh, we
every.
we didn't do white people. We did.
Oh no. So I think it was gays and lesbians, right? That
Yeah,
you tried.
we did. So we did Christian jokes, Muslim jokes, Jewish jokes, LGBT jokes, and then jokes about men, jokes about women,
Yeah.
and then mental health. Mental health was
Yeah,
the
mental health. Yeah.
yeah.
But what did the Hindus do to you, man? Why did you spare us?
Look, we only had a budget for a certain amount of episodes, and look, Hindu jokes, Indian jokes were definitely on the short list, but for what was the reason why we didn't? There was, yes, that's right, because we were going to do Indian jokes, but then I said, if we open the racial jokes, then you can't just do Indian jokes. If we're going to do Indian jokes, you have to do white people jokes. You have to do jokes about black people. You have to do all of this as well. But then I guess the religion, yeah, because we did do Muslim jokes, Jewish jokes, Christian jokes. In Australia, they're the predominant religions. Hinduism isn't that prominent here in Australia, so that was also another part of it. But well, I'm still hoping there are more episodes, and either Hindu jokes or Indian jokes will definitely be in the second season. So if a second season is produced, don't worry, there will definitely be some Hindu and or Indian jokes there.
Yeah, so I sincerely hope that happens, man, because I was like, damn it, we're missing out in this one too. Nobody wants to make fun of us now.
I've done enough Indian jokes throughout my career as well, so there's no shortage of that there.
Yeah, but it would have been really interesting because see, I'll tell you why it's interesting, because now, because of the internet, the world has kind of become very interconnected. So when you do jokes which are very specifically on Hindus and Indians, because internet now has boomed so much in India, and it has not just the internet now is not just a urban phenomenon. It's going into tier 2, tier 3 cities. In many cases, it's reaching, slowly seeping into rural India too, the internet. So it would be very interesting as to a lot of people reacting to how you guys do. Like Russell, obviously Russell's audiences are primarily urban English speaking Indians. So
Yeah.
I mean, it travels well. But like, I know Russell Peters is now slowly, through his YouTube videos, going into the tier 2, tier 3 cities where they kind of find Russell Peters very interesting. They may not relate to him completely, but they find him interesting enough to actually watch Russell Peters. So yeah, I was so looking forward to it. And that's when I had actually shared it for the first time too, and I tweeted it. I was like, my only complaint is that, you know, Neel has not made fun of Hindus. So it's like we feel left out, and I want to see what happens. And just for the experiment, I don't know how Indians would react to it when and Hindus would react to it when somebody cracks jokes at them. And you know, you're one of their, you know, you're still Indian, right? So I guess it would be a very interesting experiment now that you're experimenting in crossing the line, right?
Yeah. Like I said, there was a short list of topics, and there were a few. I wrote some of the jokes. There were a team of writers though, and Indian jokes was actually on that short list, and some of the jokes they did write, ironically enough, it wasn't that I was offended, but I just sort of rolled my eyes and thought, okay, yeah, that's just a dumb joke. So it would have been interesting actually, and then I would have been on the couch and responding to some of those jokes, and I would have also liked to have listened into the jokes about men, and maybe if they did jokes about comedians, that would be really funny, because I was thinking about I do a podcast and we talk about this a lot. We talk about just identity, and the way people perceive their identity is probably the biggest trigger point as to what would offend them when it comes to comedy. So comedian is one of the largest parts of my identity, more so than Aussie, Indian, brown, male, whatever. Comedian is a major part of who I am. So if people are degrading and mocking comedy, again, ironically enough, I can't imagine I'd take to that too well. I mean, if it's done well, because there's a lot I could say about comedians that probably should be made fun of, but if it's done in that sort of degrading way, I can't imagine I'd respond too well to that. So that I would love to actually be on the receiving end of some of those jokes one day, because my whole career is writing jokes. I very rarely am actually in the audience listening to jokes, and when I am, I can't help but overanalyze all the structure of a joke, and I could see that punchline coming a mile away, or why isn't anyone laughing at that joke? That's a brilliant joke. I feel like comedy is almost like, in many instances, it can almost be like a drug, because the more you're exposed to it, the harder hit you need to get the same effect. So I find myself now, 10 years into comedy, I need the really inappropriate, offensive comedy, because the other comedy just doesn't do it for me because I've built up a tolerance or something. So look, I'm sure there'll be Hindu jokes or Indian jokes soon enough. It's just a matter of when.
You know what? I can't wait for it. Trust me. I'm a huge fan of stand-up comedy. I follow it all the time. Like, I don't know. I've seen all 14 specials of George Carlin. I somehow managed to get them on the internet because they're not available in India. But then
they're all on they're on that website, Dailymotion, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's great.
He's awesome. I mean, we would not get these things in India, right? Growing up, we would not have access to any of these comics. So I actually got exposed to stand-up comedy. I remember there was this club in Toronto for the first time in my life when I had gone to study in York University, Canada, and I saw Russell Peters perform in a comedy club, and then I saw Russell Peters, and I paid a bomb. At that time, I remember I hardly paid anything in that bar or that comedy club, and then I paid a bomb to watch Russell in Mumbai, and I was so happy actually to see growth of Russell Peters, and I genuinely wish all comics all success, especially right now with COVID going on, and there's basically nothing in the entertainment industry, at least in America, is shut, and in India everything is shut right now. So it's actually very tragic. So yeah, and you're one of my favorite comics now, because I would say you're one of the smart ones out there who actually is very observant and who likes doing likes to poke fun at things that nobody wants to talk about. So yeah, man, thank you so much for coming. And it's an absolute pleasure to watch you perform. And I hopefully one day, whenever I get to visit Australia, I did visit in 2018, maybe one day I'll get to see you live in Australia too, man.
Let me know if you're over here. I'll hook you up with some tickets, and hopefully we can meet face to face one day.
Yeah, man, I'm looking forward to it, guys. I would be very happy. Let's just say that. So guys, it's time to wrap things up. Once again, you know the drill. Subscribe, like. I've left a link to Neel's YouTube channel in the description of the podcast. I insist, if you've not seen the series Crossing the Line, go and watch it. Not only do you watch it, let me know in the comments what did you feel after watching that series. And if you're people in India who are watching this, just put yourself in a situation. I want you to do this thought experiment. Just think all those jokes were on you, and then tell me honestly, how did you guys feel about it? I want you guys to do that thought experiment for it. You know the drill, guys. If you like what I'm doing over here, support me on YouTube, Patreon. You know the jazz. Until then, namaste, goodbye, see you next time.